"Your son's coming with us," the man said, and the sound of his voice didn't match the badge on his chest. It was too flat, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror instead of earning it on the street. The late afternoon sun was still hanging over the cul-de-sac, baking the asphalt until the air shimmered, and I could smell that hot plastic scent coming off their SUV before I even stepped out onto my porch. Lucas's sneakers scraped against the concrete as one of them lightly gripped his arm, not violent, not rough, but firm in a way that didn't belong on my property, not on my kid. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't run. I just walked forward, slow, steady, the way you move when you're trying to understand a situation before you control it. My name is Ethan Walker, and I've spent most of my adult life reading people in places where hesitation gets you hurt, and right away something about these two didn't line up. Their uniforms were clean, too clean, nowhere on the edges, no dust on the boots, even though they were standing on a driveway that kicked up grit with every step. One of them had a radio clipped to his shoulder, and it hissed faintly, a loop of static that never quite broke into real chatter. Lucas looked back at me, confusion written across his face, not fear yet, just that split second where a kid tries to figure out if this is real or some kind of mistake. "Dad?" he said, and that was the only word he got out before the woman standing behind them stepped forward, heels clicking against the pavement like she owned the ground she was walking on. Diane Holloway, HOA president. Perfect hair, perfect smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Walker," she said, sweet as iced tea left too long in the sun, "your son violated community regulations. We're handling it." I tasted something metallic at the back of my tongue. Not anger, not yet, just that shift when everything slows down and details start to sharpen. I glanced at the badge again. The font was off. Subtle but wrong. The edges caught the light like cheap metal, not the dull, worn finish real ones carry. "Which department?" I asked, keeping my voice even, calm enough that anyone watching might think I was just another concerned parent. The man holding Lucas hesitated. Half a second. That's all it took. "Community enforcement," he said, and the words landed like they didn't belong in his mouth. Behind me, I heard a door open, then another. Neighbors. Phones coming out. The soft click of cameras starting to record. Diane shifted her weight, just slightly, like she was adjusting for an audience. "We don't need to make this difficult," she added, her tone tightening under the sugar. I stepped closer, close enough now to see the fine details. The stitching on the uniform, the way the name tag sat just a fraction too high, the faint smell of cologne trying to cover up nervous sweat. Lucas's arm tensed under the man's grip, and I placed my hand lightly on my son's shoulder, not pulling him away, just anchoring him. "You can let go," I said quietly, not a command, not yet, just a statement placed exactly where it needed to be. The radio crackled again, the same loop, the same empty noise. And in that moment, standing in my own driveway with the sun burning down and the neighborhood watching, I knew exactly what I was looking at. Not officers, not authority, just two men playing dress up, backed by someone who thought power was something you could fake. I reached into my pocket, slow enough that no one could mistake the movement, and pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up against my palm as I looked straight at the one holding my son. "You picked the wrong house," I said, my voice still calm, still steady, but carrying just enough weight to make his fingers loosen without him even realizing it. And then I made the call. I did not look away from him when I raised the phone to my ear, and that is something you learn early. You never break eye contact when someone is trying to pretend they have control, because the second you do, they start believing their own story. The line clicked once, then twice, and the voice on the other end came in clear and professional. No background noise, no hesitation, just the way it is supposed to sound when you are talking to someone who actually knows what they are doing. "Walker," I said, calm, measured, every word placed exactly where it needed to land. "I need verification on two individuals presenting as law enforcement on a private residential property. No visible department identification. Possible impersonation." There was a pause on the other end, not confusion, not delay, just processing, the kind that happens fast and quiet. And then the response came back sharper, more focused, like a switch had been flipped somewhere I could not see. Behind me, I could hear more footsteps on pavement, the low murmur of neighbors talking under their breath, the faint electronic chirp of someone zooming in with their phone camera, capturing every second of this little performance Diane had staged. The man holding Lucas shifted his stance, just slightly, and I felt it through my son's shoulder under my hand. That small adjustment that says something inside him just started to slip. "Sir, you need to step back," he said, but the authority in his voice was thinning now, stretched too tight, like a line about to snap. I did not move. I did not raise my voice. I just tilted my head a fraction, studying him the same way I would study a map before making a move. His partner glanced toward Diane, quick, almost instinctive, like he was waiting for her to tell him what came next, and that told me everything I needed to know. Real officers do not look to civilians for direction. They do not wait for permission to act. Diane caught that look and stepped forward again, her smile tightening at the edges, the sweetness turning brittle. "This is a community matter," she said, louder now, projecting for the audience that had gathered. "We are handling it according to HOA guidelines." The words hung in the air, heavy and hollow, and for a second all you could hear was the faint hiss of that fake radio and the distant hum of a lawn mower somewhere down the block. I shifted my weight, placing myself fully between Lucas and the two men, not aggressive, not confrontational, just present, immovable. My thumb tapped the phone once, a signal on the line that I was still here, still watching, still waiting. "They are claiming jurisdiction under a homeowners association," I added, quietly into the receiver, my eyes never leaving the man in front of me. No legal documentation presented. That was when the first flicker of real uncertainty crossed his face. It was small, barely there, but it was enough. Lucas's fingers curled into the back of my shirt, and I could feel the tension in his grip, the question he was not asking out loud. I lowered my head just enough so he could hear me without anyone else catching the words. "You are fine," I said, steady, certain, the way you speak when there is no room for doubt. "Stay right here." The air felt different now, heavier, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks, and somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, I heard it, the low, rising sound of real sirens cutting through the neighborhood noise, getting closer with every second. The man in front of me heard it too. His eyes flicked toward the street, then back to me, and this time there was no confidence left in them, just calculation, like he was trying to figure out how fast this situation was about to turn against him. I ended the call with a single tap and slipped the phone back into my pocket, letting the silence stretch just long enough to settle over all of us. Then I looked at him, really looked this time, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward his hand still resting on my son's arm. "Last chance," I said, my voice low, even, and final. "Let go." The sound of sirens grew louder, no longer distant, no longer abstract, but real and cutting through the thick afternoon air like a blade. And the moment it hit the street at the end of the cul-de-sac, everything shifted in a way you could feel in your chest before you could see it. The man's fingers loosened from Lucas's arm, not all at once, not dramatic, just a slow release, like his body was making the decision before his mind caught up. I did not move. I did not rush it. I just stood there, steady, letting the weight of that sound do the work for me. The second man took a step back, his boots finally scuffing the pavement, kicking up a faint line of dust that caught the sunlight, and his radio gave one last empty hiss before going quiet, like it knew the act was over. Diane's smile flickered, just for a fraction of a second, the polished edges cracking enough to show something underneath that she could not quite hide anymore. "There is no need for this," she said quickly, her tone shifting, trying to pull the moment back under her control, but the words did not land the same way now. Nobody was listening to her anymore. The first patrol car turned into the street, tires rolling slow, deliberate, the engine low and steady, followed by a second one right behind it. Lights flashing against the rows of identical houses, painting everything in red and blue that reflected off windows and windshields and the glossy hood of Diane's car. The officers stepped out with the kind of presence you cannot fake, movements efficient, eyes scanning, taking in the scene in a matter of seconds. One of them looked at me first, not at Diane, not at the two men in uniforms, but at me, and there was recognition there, not personal, but procedural, the kind that comes from a call that carries weight. "Sir," he said, calm, professional, "we received a report." I gave a small nod toward the two men. "They claimed authority," I said, my voice even, no emotion, just facts laid out clean. No department identification. Attempted to remove a minor from private property. The words hung there, simple and direct, and you could almost see the shift in the officer's posture as they turned their attention fully to the pair standing a few feet away. The man who had been holding Lucas opened his mouth, like he was about to explain, but nothing came out at first, just a dry breath, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain. His partner tried to step forward, hands slightly raised, already talking, already trying to reshape the narrative. "We are with the community enforcement," he started, but the officer cut him off with a look that did not need words to carry meaning. Real authority does not argue. It ends conversations. Diane stepped in again, faster this time, her heels clicking sharper against the pavement, her voice rising just enough to try to reclaim the audience that had gathered. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, forcing a laugh that did not sound natural anymore. "We were simply addressing a violation." The officer nearest her turned his head slowly, his expression neutral, but firm. "Ma'am," he said, measured, controlled. "Please step back." It was not loud. It did not need to be. The effect was immediate. Diane stopped. Just stopped. The kind of stop that comes when someone realizes they are no longer the one in charge. I felt Lucas shift closer behind me, his grip still tight on my shirt, and I placed my hand over his, grounding him, letting him feel that everything had already turned. The second patrol car door closed with a solid thud behind the other officers, sealing the scene, and the air settled into a heavy silence broken only by the faint clicking of phone cameras and the low murmur of neighbors who had just watched the entire balance of power flip in real time. I looked at the two men again, really looked this time, and now there was no performance left in them, no script, no posture, just the realization settling in as the situation closed around them. And I did not say anything else. I did not need to. The moment had already spoken for itself. The officer closest to the two men took one step forward, not rushed, not aggressive, just controlled. And that single movement changed everything because it drew a line none of them could step back across. The man who had been holding Lucas dropped his hand completely now, letting it fall to his side, as if it suddenly weighed too much, and I felt my son shift fully behind me, his breathing uneven but steadying with every second that passed. "I am going to need both of you to identify yourselves," the officer said, his voice calm, firm, and carrying the kind of authority that does not need to repeat itself. The two men glanced at each other again, that same silent exchange, but this time there was no confidence behind it, just hesitation stretching longer than it should. One of them reached up, touching the badge on his chest like he could anchor himself to it, but even from where I stood, I could see the slight tremor in his fingers. "We told you," he said, trying to recover. "Community enforcement, authorized by the HOA." The words sounded weaker now, thinner, like they had already lost their weight the moment real officers stepped onto the scene. The second officer circled slightly to the side, not closing in, just repositioning, watching, reading, and that subtle shift boxed them in without a single word needing to be said. Diane took a breath, sharper this time, and stepped forward again, but slower, more cautious, like she was testing ground that was no longer solid under her feet. "Officers, this is being blown out of proportion," she said, her voice still carrying that polished tone, but now edged with something tighter, something strained. "We are simply enforcing neighborhood guidelines, and this homeowner is refusing to cooperate." The officer nearest her did not even look at me this time. His focus stayed on her, steady, unblinking. "Ma'am," he said again, just as controlled as before, "you do not have authority to detain anyone, especially a minor." The word minor landed hard, sharper than anything else that had been said so far, and I watched Diane's posture shift, just slightly, her shoulders pulling back like she was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Behind us, the quiet murmur of neighbors grew a little louder, the soft rustle of movement as more people stepped out, phones raised, capturing every second, and I could hear the faint clicks and taps as they zoomed in, adjusted angles, locked focus on the moment everything was unraveling. The first man swallowed, his jaw tightening, and then he tried again, his voice lower now, almost defensive. "We were instructed to bring the boy in for questioning," he said, and the way he said boy instead of his name made something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, just clarity. The officer tilted his head slightly, considering that, then gave a small nod to his partner. No rush. No escalation. Just a decision being made. Turn around, he said, simple and direct. And for a second the world seemed to pause, like everyone was waiting to see if they would comply or keep pretending. They did not argue this time. They did not posture. They just moved, slow, uncertain, like men waking up from a dream that had gone too far. Diane's breath caught, audible even over the low hum of the street, and she took a half step back, her heel clicking awkwardly against the pavement, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. "This is unnecessary," she said quickly, her voice rising just enough to crack at the edges. "I know people in the city. This will not." She stopped herself mid-sentence when the second officer finally turned toward her fully, his expression unchanged but his attention unmistakable. "Ma'am," he said, measured and final. "You will have a chance to explain everything." That was it. No threat, no raised voice. Just a statement that closed the door on whatever control she thought she had. I felt Lucas's grip loosen slightly at the back of my shirt, his fingers no longer digging in, and I placed my hand over his again, steady, grounding, letting him feel the shift that had already settled into the air. The flashing lights reflected off the windows, painting the street in slow pulses, and in that rhythm, the truth became impossible to ignore. This was never about rules. It was never about enforcement. It was about someone believing they could take something that did not belong to them. And now, with real authority standing right in front of them, that illusion was gone. The air did not move for a few seconds after that, like the whole street was holding its breath, and then everything started again in slow, controlled motion. One officer guided the two men a few steps away from Lucas and me, not rough, not dramatic, just firm and procedural, while the other stayed positioned between us and Diane, creating space without making it look like a barrier. I could hear the faint click of metal as equipment shifted on their belts, the low murmur of radio chatter now real, crisp, carrying actual words instead of that empty static loop from before. The difference was undeniable. Real. Grounded. "Sir, I am going to ask you a few questions," the first officer said to one of the men, his tone steady, professional, but there was an edge to it now, something sharper beneath the surface. The man nodded quickly, too quickly, like he was trying to cooperate his way out of something that had already gone too far. "We were just following instructions," he said, his voice lower, losing that forced authority it had earlier. "She told us to enforce the rules." He tilted his head slightly toward Diane without fully turning, like he did not want to look at her anymore. That small movement said more than anything else he could have explained. Diane's expression tightened again, her lips pressing into a thin line before she forced them back into something that looked like composure but felt hollow. "That is not what I said," she replied quickly, stepping forward despite the officer's presence, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach the neighbors still watching. "I asked them to address a violation. That is all." The officer in front of her did not move, but his posture shifted just enough to block her path without making it obvious. "Ma'am," he said again, calm but firmer now, "please remain where you are." The repetition was deliberate, controlled, final. She stopped, not because she wanted to, but because she understood that pushing further would not work anymore. Behind me, Lucas exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing as the reality of the situation settled in. I could feel the warmth of the sun still on the back of my neck, but it did not feel as sharp anymore, like the heat had broken along with everything else. One of the officers turned slightly toward me, his attention shifting just enough to acknowledge my presence without losing focus on the situation. "Sir, thank you for your call," he said, his tone respectful, direct. I gave a small nod, nothing more. There was no need for anything else. Everything that needed to be said had already been laid out in front of us. The second man, the one who had stayed quieter, finally spoke up, his voice strained now, uncertain. "We thought we had authority," he said, almost to himself, like he was realizing it as he said it out loud. The officer closest to him did not respond right away. He just watched him for a second, then gave a small, measured nod, the kind that acknowledges a statement without agreeing with it. "Authority comes with responsibility," he said evenly, "and with limits." The words settled into the space between them, simple but heavy, and I could see the effect immediately. The man looked down, his shoulders dropping just slightly, the last of that earlier posture gone. Diane inhaled sharply again, like she was preparing to say something else, to regain control of the narrative one more time. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. Her eyes moved across the scene, taking in the officers, the neighbors, the phone still recording, and for the first time since this started, she looked uncertain. Not angry, not defensive, just uncertain. I shifted my stance slightly, turning just enough so Lucas was fully behind me, shielded from the center of it all, and rested my hand lightly on his shoulder again. He looked up at me, searching, and I gave him a small nod, steady and calm. The kind that tells you everything is already handled. The flashing lights continued to pulse across the houses, slower now, less urgent, but still present, a reminder of what had just unfolded. And standing there in my own driveway, with the weight of the moment settling into something quiet and undeniable, I knew this was the point where everything changed for them, not because of force, not because of noise, but because the truth had finally shown up, and there was no way to push it back out. The officers did not rush anything, and that was the part most people do not understand about real control. It is not loud, it is not fast, it is patient and precise, and it lets the truth unfold on its own. One of them stepped slightly aside, speaking quietly into his shoulder radio, the words clear, structured, official, nothing like the empty static that had been playing from those fake devices earlier. And the contrast hung in the air like a line drawn between reality and whatever. Performance had just collapsed. The two men stood there now without posture, without direction, their shoulders slightly slumped, their eyes moving more than they should, scanning for something that was no longer there, some exit that had already closed. Diane shifted again, slower this time, her heels making a softer sound against the pavement as if even she was trying not to draw attention anymore. But attention was already locked on her, the neighbors, the phones, the quiet weight of witnesses that could not be undone. "This is being handled incorrectly," she said, her voice lower now, controlled but strained, like she was trying to regain footing on ground that kept slipping. "We have documentation, we have authority under the association." The officer nearest her did not interrupt, he let her finish, and that silence worked against her more than any argument could have. When she stopped, he gave a small nod, not agreement, just acknowledgement. "You can provide any documentation you have," he said evenly, "but that does not extend to detaining individuals." The word detaining settled again, heavier this time, reinforced, undeniable. One of the men glanced up at Diane when he heard it, and there was something in that look that had not been there before, not loyalty, not confidence, but doubt. The kind that shows up when someone realizes they followed the wrong person into the wrong situation. I could feel Lucas shift slightly behind me, his breathing steadier now, his grip no longer tight, but still present, like he needed the contact to confirm what his eyes were seeing. I kept my hand on his shoulder, light, constant, the kind of pressure that says stay right here. Everything is under control. The officer who had been speaking into the radio stepped back into position, his expression unchanged. But there was a clarity to the way he moved now, like the next steps had already been decided somewhere beyond this street. "We are going to sort this out properly," he said, his tone calm, but carrying finality. "For now, no one is leaving." It was not a threat. It was a boundary, and it landed exactly where it needed to. The second man exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost under the faint hum of engines and the distant chirp of a bird somewhere down the block. But it was there, a release of something that had been building since the moment they stepped onto my driveway. Diane looked around again, taking in the scene from a different angle now, not as the center of it, but as part of it. And I watched the realization settle in behind her eyes, piece by piece. This was no longer her stage. The narrative had moved beyond her reach. The officer closest to the two men gestured slightly toward the patrol car, not forceful, just indicating direction, and they followed, quiet, compliant, the performance completely gone. I did not say anything. I did not step forward. I stayed exactly where I was, grounded in my own space, with my son behind me and the truth unfolding in front of us. The flashing lights reflected across the windows again, slower now, almost rhythmic, and in that steady pulse, everything felt clearer. Not louder, not dramatic, just clear. And as I stood there, feeling the heat of the day start to ease, I knew this moment was not about what had just happened. It was about what they had tried to make happen, and how quickly it had unraveled the second real authority stepped into the frame. The street had gone quiet in a different way now, not the tense silence from before, but the kind that comes after something breaks and everyone is trying to process what they just witnessed. The officers moved with purpose, but without urgency, guiding the situation forward step by step, while the neighbors stayed where they were, phones still raised, capturing the aftermath as much as the event itself. One of the officers approached me again, stopping a few feet away, giving just enough space to keep things respectful, but close enough to keep the conversation direct. "Sir, we are going to need a brief statement," he said, his tone calm, professional, the same steady cadence that had been there from the moment they arrived. I nodded once. "They approached my property," I said, keeping it simple, factual, the way it should be. "Identified themselves as law enforcement. Attempted to remove my son without documentation." The officer listened without interrupting, his eyes steady, taking in every word, and when I finished, he gave a small nod like he was placing those facts exactly where they belonged. Behind him, the two men stood near the patrol car, no longer speaking, no longer trying to explain, just waiting, their earlier certainty completely gone, replaced by something quieter, something more real. Diane, however, was not finished. I could hear her before I saw her move again, the sharp intake of breath, the shift of weight, and then her voice cutting through the space, louder than it had been since the officers arrived. "This is excessive," she said, her tone rising, trying to reclaim attention that had already moved past her. "This neighborhood has standards, and we have the right to enforce them." The officer closest to her turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence, and that small movement was enough to redirect the entire scene back toward her. "Standards do not override the law," he replied, his voice even, but carrying a firmness that left no room for interpretation. Diane's expression tightened again, her composure slipping in small, controlled cracks that she could not fully hide anymore. She glanced around at the neighbors, at the phone still pointed in her direction, and for a moment, the confidence she had carried at the start of this was nowhere to be found. I shifted my stance slightly, feeling the gravel under my boots, grounding myself in the moment, and I realized something important right then. This was not about convincing anyone anymore. The truth had already done that. This was about letting it stand. Lucas stepped a little closer behind me, his shoulder brushing against my back, and I reached down, resting my hand briefly on his arm, a quiet reassurance that everything was where it needed to be. The officer who had been speaking with me finished noting something down, then looked back up. "We will handle the rest from here," he said, and there was something final in that statement, something that closed the door on everything that had happened before they arrived. I gave another small nod. No words. None were needed. Diane took one last step forward, like she was about to say something else, something to salvage whatever she could from this, but she stopped herself halfway, her gaze dropping for just a second before lifting again, and in that moment, it was clear. She understood. Not fully, not completely, but enough to know that the situation was no longer hers to control. The flashing lights reflected across the pavement, slower now, steady, almost calm, and the sound of real radio communication filled the air, replacing the artificial noise that had started all of this. The scene was no longer chaotic. It was structured, ordered, real. And as I stood there, with my son safe behind me and the weight of the moment settling into something quiet and undeniable, I knew this was the point where everything shifted permanently, not because of what I had said, but because of what they had tried to do, and how clearly it had been exposed the moment it met something real. By the time the second round of radio confirmations came through, the energy of the entire street had shifted from tension to something heavier, something final, like the moment after a verdict has already been decided and everyone is just waiting for it to be spoken out loud. One of the officers stepped away briefly, speaking into his radio again, his tone lower now, but precise, referencing codes and confirmations that meant nothing to most people watching, but everything to the ones involved. The two men stood near the patrol car, hands visible, posture neutral, no resistance, no performance left, just quiet compliance as the reality settled deeper into them with every passing second. Diane tried one more time, but it was different now, not loud, not commanding, just strained. "There has to be some mistake," she said, her voice thinner. The confidence that once filled it now replaced by something uncertain, almost searching. "We were told this was within our rights." The officer closest to her turned fully this time, his attention locking onto her in a way that made it clear she was no longer just part of the scene. She was now central to it. "Who told you that?" he asked, not aggressively, not accusing, just direct. The question hung there longer than anything else had all afternoon. Diane opened her mouth, then stopped, her eyes flicking toward the two men, then back to the officer. And for the first time since this began, she did not have an immediate answer. That silence did more damage than anything she could have said. One of the men shifted his weight and finally spoke again, his voice low, almost resigned. "She hired us," he said, not looking at her this time. "Told us to act like enforcement, said it would make people comply faster." The words landed clean, simple, and irreversible. You could feel it ripple through the people watching, the quiet murmur rising just slightly, phones adjusting to capture every second of what had just been revealed. Diane's face tightened, her composure cracking in visible lines now, no longer subtle, no longer controlled. "That is not what I meant," she said quickly, but the words came too fast, too defensive, and they did not carry the same weight anymore. The officer gave a small nod, not agreeing, just acknowledging that he had heard enough. "We will sort that out," he said, calm and final. The second officer stepped closer to the two men, speaking to them quietly, guiding them through the next steps with the same steady tone. No escalation, no drama, just procedure unfolding exactly as it should. The difference between what had been staged earlier and what was happening now could not have been clearer. Lucas shifted again behind me, this time stepping slightly to the side so he could see, his eyes wide, but no longer confused, just absorbing everything, trying to understand how quickly things had changed. I placed my hand lightly on the back of his shoulder, steady, grounding, letting him feel that this moment, as intense as it was already under control. The officer who had spoken with me earlier glanced in my direction once more, a brief acknowledgement, then returned his focus to the situation at hand. Diane stood still now, completely still, her arms at her sides, her posture no longer commanding, no longer leading, just present in a moment she could not influence anymore. The flashing lights continued their slow rhythm across the houses, reflecting in her eyes, and for a second, she looked smaller than she had when this started, not physically, but in presence, in control, in everything that had once defined her role in this neighborhood. The radio crackled again, this time clear, confirming next steps, and the officers responded in short, precise exchanges that carried authority without ever needing to raise their voices. I stood there, feeling the shift settle completely, the moment no longer tense, no longer uncertain, just resolved. And as the truth laid itself out in plain sight, piece by piece, without force, without noise, I understood something that most people never get to see this clearly. Power that is real does not need to prove itself. It just shows up, and everything else falls apart around it. The last set of instructions came through the radio in short, clear bursts, and with each word, the scene settled deeper into something final, something that no longer needed tension to hold it together. The officers moved with quiet efficiency, guiding the two men toward the patrol car, their voices low, steady, explaining the process in a way that left no room for confusion, and this time there was no hesitation from either of them. No attempt to argue, no effort to hold onto the role they had tried to play earlier. They simply followed. Diane did not move. She stood where she was, shoulders slightly drawn in now, her posture no longer sharp or commanding, just still, like she had finally reached the point where there was nothing left to say that could change what had already happened. The officer who had been speaking with her took a step closer, not invading her space, just enough to bring the conversation into focus. "Ma'am, we are going to need you to remain available," he said, his tone calm, professional, but carrying a weight that made it clear this was no longer optional. She nodded, but it was delayed, almost automatic, like the response came a second too late, her eyes drifting for a moment toward the neighbors, toward the phone still raised, capturing everything she had tried to control now playing out beyond her reach. I could hear the low hum of engines, the steady rhythm of flashing lights reflecting across the windows and pavement, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then went quiet again, like even that small interruption understood it did not belong in this moment. Lucas stepped slightly forward from behind me now, just enough to see more clearly, his hand no longer gripping my shirt, but still close, still within reach, and I let him move, keeping my presence steady beside him, not shielding him anymore, just standing with him as the situation resolved itself. One of the officers returned to me briefly, his expression composed, his tone respectful. "Everything is under control," he said, and I gave a small nod, because it had been under control the moment real authority stepped in. The rest was just the process catching up to that fact. Diane finally spoke again, but her voice had changed completely, stripped of the sharp edges it had before. "I was trying to maintain order," she said quietly, almost to herself, like she was searching for something to hold on to, something that would make sense of what had just happened. The officer did not respond right away. He just looked at her for a moment, then gave a slight nod that carried no judgment, just acknowledgement. "Order comes from the law," he said evenly, "not from assumptions." The words landed softly, but they stayed. They did not need to be repeated. The patrol car door closed with a solid, final sound, and the two men were no longer part of the scene, their presence reduced to the consequences of what they had agreed to do. The radios continued to crackle with short confirmations, the officers moving into the final steps of their process, and the neighbors slowly began to lower their phones, the intensity of the moment fading into something quieter, something that would be talked about long after the lights were gone. I stood there for a second longer, taking in the street, the houses, the place that was supposed to be simple, predictable, controlled by rules that were never meant to replace the law. Lucas looked up at me, his expression calmer now, grounded again, and I gave him a small nod, the same one I had given him earlier, steady and certain. We turned back toward the house together, the gravel crunching lightly under our steps, the sound familiar, normal, unchanged by everything that had just happened. Behind us, the officers continued their work, the last of the flashing lights reflecting across the pavement as the scene closed itself out piece by piece. And as I reached the front door, I paused for just a second, looking back once more, not at the people, not at the cars, but at the space where it had all unfolded. They thought authority was something you could wear, something you could borrow, something you could use to take what you wanted. But real authority does not need to announce itself. It shows up, it stands its ground, and when it does, everything built on nothing disappears without a fight.